Hey everybody, welcome to the channel. Michael Noland here, and tonight I'm going to be talking about the remixed Beatles albums, and we're going to be ranking them on several levels here. And at the end of the video, I will not only just give a generalized ranking, but I'm going to grade these suckers. Alright, so what I'm talking about here are the albums that, for the most part, Giles and his team have gone in and not only just had these albums remastered, but remixed them from the ground up. So what better album to start off with than perhaps the most famous rock album of all time? It's been voted as the #1 rock album of all time more often than any other album in history. Of course, I'm talking about the Beatles' magnificent Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Now, historically, the Beatles have admitted many times that most of their efforts, and perhaps even their recording team's efforts in doing a final mixdown, were given to the mono mixes. And so a lot of Beatle purists have really searched out mono mix versions of these albums, and they're fantastic. But I've always been a stereo guy, and I'd even put up with some of those horrible stereo mixes that we had quite up until recently. Now, this lack of attention to stereo mixes was done for a couple of reasons. First of all, really, if you can believe this, during the late 60s, a lot of people thought stereo was a gimmick. It would come and it would go. Much like quad stereo. Everybody thought that was going to be the wave of the future, and perhaps it was a precursor to 5.1 stereo mixes. And so the mixes were done primarily as almost a gimmick to have such an expansive side-to-side sound on the stereo spectrum for the audiophiles of the time. And unfortunately, their approach often was put the whole damn band on this side with lead vocals over here, and we got very raw stereo mixes. So when Giles and his team turned their attention to this magnificent album, they had a bit more to work with than they did, say, with Revolver and albums recorded before. You see, Sgt. Pepper's was a 4-track recording, just like Revolver and Rubber Soul before it. But this time they employed 2 4-track machines in tandem and did a lot of transferring of stereo mixes onto the next recorder, right? And so due to that, Giles could go back to even earlier mixes that many people were using up until that point. These mixes would have maybe 2 or 3 instruments mixed into a stereo spectrum. He could use technology to separate those a little bit better, where prior mixes would have used the bounce after that, where they added yet another 4 instruments. This helped to clarify what we hear on this wonderful remix. Excellent examples of his whole approach here was She's Leaving Home. He was able to isolate the original recording for the orchestra on that particular song and give us a much more blended feel. On Lovely Rita, he was able to separate instruments from the left and put them over to the right, and guess what? We had a stereo version of really the mono mix. Amazing. On Sgt. Pepper's Reprise, they took the organ off the left side, put it over to the right side, same effect. And on A Day in a Life, Giles was able to access the original orchestra recording, not the mix of that orchestra, okay? And so he was able to remix it from the ground up, and it is so much more clear in this wonderful remix. Wonderful album. With outtakes of several different kinds, as well as the inclusion of different variations of Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields Forever, this was a feast to behold, no doubt. But how does it rank with the rest of these remixes? Well, let's go on to another. Officially titled The Beatles, commonly known as the White Album, we get everything but the kitchen sink thrown in. That's already there. What do I mean by that? Well, how about the 50 tracks offered in this remix? not only 50 various tracks, but we have the wonderful Escher demos. Now, I've heard the Escher demos called the Escher demos, the Escher demos. I'm not sure how it's pronounced, but they were at George's bungalow, and the four of them got together with acoustic guitars primarily and started working on material that they had written predominantly while still in India. You know, the Beatles during these demo recordings were still working as a unit, and it comes across so clearly. And we can also see by these demos, they had a very clear idea on where they were going, and that idea was, we'll go anywhere we want. This album wasn't going to be one of those albums that had an identity with a certain type of song structure or a style of songs or just a couple of styles of songs. This album would run the gambit. Now, this album, like I said, was a remix as well. And when I listened to it, I really did like these remixes. I thought they were clean. They didn't get rid of anything that was previously on the album. They only accented what was already there. A very light touch by Giles Martin, a wonderful touch, and a worthy remix, no doubt. Now that leads us to Abbey Road. Now, I've often said Abbey Road is the Beatles' very best album. I've also said it's not my favorite album, although it's way up there on the list. And any Beatles album is a feast to the ears, as I've stated before. But this is the first remix done by Giles and his team I didn't care for. Yes, they brought up a lot of sonic textures that were highlighted, but to my ears, they would subdue sonic textures that we had already come to enjoy, burying some of the instruments deeper in the mix, and I think that's wrong. You know what? I'm all for remixing these older albums from the 60s. Often, the very best the artist could offer was hampered by the very technology, and if we have the technology and are respectful enough, this is going to be to our good every single time. But if they approach remixes like they did with this album, I'm afraid I'll stay OG every single time. You know, in my opinion, this is the one Beatles album that didn't really even need to be touched. But when I heard that it was being remixed, I was hoping it would add sparkle. And sparkle it does add, but at the cost of some of the instruments, and I don't like that. The outtakes are fine, there's no problem with that, but like I said, Abbey Road, as it was released, and of course it was recorded and mixed on latter technology, still the 60s, late 60s technology, but it was the best that Abbey Road had to offer at the time, and guess what, folks? It was good enough. Which gets us to Let It Be, and the same problem ensued. Again, too much monkeying with the original recordings on this album. Now, Let It Be, I love Let It Be. There isn't an album by the Beatles I don't love, but I was slightly disappointed when it came out, only because there was way too much chatter. The chatter wasn't all that funny or interesting. I know a lot of you out there are going, by me even saying that. That's some of your favorite stuff on that album, and I understand it. But you know what? I was more than happy when they decided to, well, remix, I guess, and definitely remaster Let It Be as Let It Be Naked. I think it got back to the original intent of what the Beatles were trying to accomplish there. A lot of folks will say, that's not fair, Michael. John was not alive. He had no decisions on that. And yet the Beatles were very careful. And you know what? When you listen to that mix, Let It Be Naked, nothing in that mix contradicts a single damn thing that John Lennon ever said about that album or any of those songs. They were really respectful, and if anybody benefited from this remix, this remaster, this different version of Let It Be, it was John Lennon, with Don't Let Me Down finally being included on that album. Okay, but that leads us to the new kid on the block, and of course that is the brand new remix of Revolver. This is a totally different animal of a remix. Actually, it's the first remix of its kind ever. What do I mean by that? Well, to understand that properly, we really have to go back to Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. You see, that was the album that the Beatles recorded right after Revolver, right? And they were still on 4-track technology, but they were using the 2 4-tracks in tandem, and they got a lot more bang for their buck. But you know, on the album just prior to that, they still used the same 4-track technology. They just didn't use 2 of them. And so when they would bounce tracks, usually in stereo pairs, say tracks 1 and 2 in a stereo pair, over to tracks 3 and 4 as they added instruments doing that, that would muddy that, right? To a degree. If they kept the bounces at a minimum, they could still get high quality sounds. And so that prevented them from adding too much there, a situation they would rectify on their next album with 2 4-tracks in tandem. That doesn't mean they were recording in 8 tracks, folks. Just because there was 2 4-tracks, 2 times 4 does not equal 8 in this sense of the word. We'll talk about that in another video. But that is the truth. That's not 8-track recording. And you know what? I think that's why the team has been doing remixes on latter Beatle albums rather than their earlier ones. I think they've been waiting for the technology to arrive, and it did arrive in the guise of technology designed for Peter Jackson's wonderful film or film series on Disney Plus, Get Back, which is just a rebranding of the original Let It Be movie, a superior movie in every sense of the word. It actually tells the story in chronological order, with the original Let It Be movie being edited to tell a certain side of the story. We've talked about that in prior videos, haven't we? But here, for the first time with this new technology, they could take each individual instrument, even the air around that instrument, and isolate it on a track. They then could split it into a stereo pair through some sort of special effects, or they could use it and isolate it over here with another instrument and another instrument, and they could put them anywhere in the stereo field they wanted. Especially when you listen to the 2009 remasters, which is the very best the stereo versions of these albums ever sounded, and it is a delight to listen to this new remix compared to that. Like I've said many times, those stereo remixes of some of the Beatles' earlier albums often made your head feel like it was lopsided, right? The bass and the drums and the guitar over here with the lead vocal and backing vocals over here and a cowbell that was far too loud in the mix. Talking about you, Taxman. And all of that would just kind of get in the way of the joy, especially if you listen to these things on headphones. And I've always been a headphones kind of guy. All right, so that gives you a bird's eye view of the album. Now I'm going to rank them, and then right after that, I'm also going to give them a letter grade, all right? In last place, the most unnecessary remix out of the entire Beatles catalog, it has to go to Abbey Road. Now, this is the one remix that they just don't stay true to the artist's original intent. And outtakes be damned, it doesn't matter. This album was an artistic statement in itself, and there's not enough revelations in the excessive material on this album and this remix to make it even worth it for me. I didn't care for it from the very get-go. I listened to it again before this video, and because of that, it has to be placed in last place. Their best album in last place. Can you believe that? All right, almost bringing up the rear, I'd have to give it to Let It Be, but only if we're talking about the remaster of Let It Be, the latest remaster I'm talking about, because you know what? If we were talking about Let It Be naked, Let It Be would be higher on this list. All right, that gets us to the top 3. The number 3 spot for me has to be Sgt. Pepper, and you know what? This mix is so good that I only put it in 3rd place behind 2nd place, because the 2nd place album holds the most revelations for your Beatle fan. And of course, in 2nd place, it has to go to the magnificent White Album, an album that was for decades my most favorite Beatle album of all. All right, so the number one position has to go to Revolver. You know, the technology on this album and the mixing and the light touch, I'm so glad they got back to the whole idea of being very light touchy on the remix, and it shows. Such respect was done with this remix, and for the first time in history, we have a wonderful stereo version of this wonderful album, my second favorite Beatle album of all time, Revolver. Okay, so with all of that in mind, what letter grades would I give these? You know, the remix of Revolver, I give an A+, and if they keep their heads about them, I can't wait to listen to Rubber Soul, which is my favorite Beatle album of all time. Just keep it light, Giles, that's all I ask. In the number 2 position, the wonderful White Album, I'll give a solid A. That is as good a remix as you're ever going to get, and I'll give an A also to Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. You know, the differences between these two remixes, the White Album only comes ahead because of such historical, significantly extra material that's added to this album. All right, Let It Be, I'll give it about a C+. Let It Be Naked, I'll give it an A-, which leads us to Abbey Road. And you know what? I'm not going to even be kind on this particular remix. This remix gets an F for me. An F- as a matter of fact. There's too many changes to the original artist intent. We got to be careful here, folks. If we start letting later generations of engineers and producers start monkeying with this music too much, we will lose what it was all about, and history will be changed and rewritten right before our eyes if we're not careful. So in the end, this is only my humble opinion, guys. You guys may have completely different opinions and for very specific reasons, and I want to hear about them in the comments. That's where this channel truly comes alive. This is a dialogue channel, folks. Now, if you enjoyed tonight's video, please consider giving it a thumbs up. That helps the YouTube algo demon and wizard better cast a spell that's more favorable to the channel, and guess what? The channel grows. Now, if you haven't had a chance to subscribe to the channel as of yet, it is easy. All you have to do is hit that subscribe to the tribe button, then hit that top bell icon, and you'll be notified of all my future videos based on really the greatest artists, the greatest bands, the greatest happenings in classic rock, as well as a few of the greatest mishappenings in today's music scene, as well as some of the good stuff too. Now, like I've said, I've got a great Deep Purple video for you guys. The writing of it has become a bit intense, but it's coming, and until I can get that uploaded, why not watch one of these? I'm Michael Noland. This is The Bottom Line. We always are the tribe, and I'll see you in my next video.